Life in prison, that's a sentence Cabazon man is given after he pleads guilty to murdering his 7-month-old son.
Baby Emmanuel Haro was reported missing in August. His body has never been found. The judge handing down the sentence to his father, Jake, this
Before we begin today's case, take a moment to like this video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to Dark Case Desk. Your support helps us continue telling the stories that demand answers, even when the truth is difficult to face. Some stories begin with a search, others begin with a lie. In mid-August of 2024, the nation's attention turned to a young couple standing before television cameras in Southern California. Their faces were strained, their voices trembled, and their message was simple, urgent, and horrifying. Their 7-month-old baby was gone. They said he had been taken. They said he had been stolen in broad daylight. They said a stranger approached, spoke a single word, and vanished with their child. His name was Emmanuel Haro, and within days, investigators would conclude that Emmanuel had not been kidnapped at all. He had already been dead. The story that captured public sympathy began on or around the 14th day of August. Rebecca Haro, the child's mother, appeared in interviews describing a terrifying encounter in a parking lot in Yucaipa, California. She claimed she had removed Emmanuel from his car seat, placed him down briefly, and turned away to prepare his diaper bag. That was when she said she heard someone speak to her in Spanish. She claimed that moment was all she remembered. According to her account, she was assaulted. According to her account, Emmanuel was taken. According to her account, a predator had vanished into thin air. Standing beside her was her husband, Jake Haro. Together they pleaded for the public's help. They begged whoever had their son to bring him home. They spoke directly to the camera, directly to viewers, directly to anyone who might be watching. What the public did not know at the time was that law enforcement had already begun to doubt every word. Within 24 hours of the report, investigators said the story began to unravel. Surveillance footage did not match the timeline. Cell phone data raised immediate red flags. Physical evidence did not support a violent abduction. And perhaps most telling of all, there was no sign that Emmanuel had been alive on the day his parents claimed he was taken. As the hours passed, the search intensified. Helicopters flew overhead. Deputies combed rural terrain. Canine units were deployed. Volunteers joined in, believing they were racing against time to save a missing infant. But behind the scenes, detectives were quietly shifting their focus. They were no longer looking for a kidnapper. They were investigating the parents. On the 21st day of August, authorities held their first press conference since the case went public, and the message was stark: the kidnapping never happened. According to the Riverside County District Attorney's Office, Emmanuel Haro was believed to have died on or around the 5th day of August. That was more than a week before his parents ever appeared on television, more than a week before the frantic pleas, more than a week before the story that had mobilized an entire community. The district attorney would later say the press conference was necessary because the defendants themselves had used the media first. They had shaped the narrative. They had asked the public to believe them, and now the truth had to be corrected. Jake and Rebecca Haro were arrested and charged with the murder of their infant son. They were also charged with filing a false police report. In court, they showed little visible emotion. They did not speak. They did not enter pleas at that hearing. Their arraignment was scheduled for early September. But even as charges were filed, one devastating question remained unanswered. Where was Emmanuel? At the press conference, the district attorney revealed something that sent a chill through the room.
Thank you, Mike. To Mike's point, I want to thank all of you in the media for covering this, specifically the parents' initial statements to the public while we were trying to find Emmanuel. They became critical as we continued through this investigation. But I want to talk about a little bit about the process because we've seen a number of questions related to Amber Alerts and things like that. So I hope when I finish this that everybody understand kind of the course of the investigation.
He said investigators had a strong indication of where Emmanuel's remains were located. He stopped short of confirming they had been recovered. He emphasized that the investigation was ongoing. What followed was a scene that would circulate widely across the internet. Jake Haro, dressed in a jail jumpsuit, was seen standing alongside deputies on a remote stretch of highway roughly 22 miles from his home. Cadaver dogs worked the area. The implication was unmistakable. This was not a search for a living child. It was a recovery operation. Officials would later confirm that Jake Haro was providing some level of cooperation. What that cooperation involved was not disclosed, but according to a nonprofit organization that had initially assisted in the search, something else had already happened behind jail walls. They reported that Jake Haro had confessed. According to the Uvalde Foundation for Kids, Jake allegedly admitted responsibility for Emmanuel's death to a Perkins informant. A Perkins informant is an undercover law enforcement officer placed in jail posing as a fellow inmate, trained to listen rather than interrogate. If confirmed and admitted into evidence, such a confession could become one of the most powerful pieces of the prosecution's case. At the time of this recording, law enforcement has not publicly confirmed the details of that alleged confession. What is known is that Rebecca Haro, held in a separate facility, continued to stand by the kidnapping story days after her husband was seen cooperating with authorities. From jail, she granted an interview to a reporter and refused to change her account. She did not place blame on her husband. She did not claim she was a victim of domestic violence. She did not deviate from the narrative she had presented since the beginning. Investigators say that narrative is false. According to the criminal complaint, Emmanuel Haro was subjected to ongoing abuse. Prosecutors believe that abuse escalated over time, ultimately leading to injuries so severe that the infant could not survive. The district attorney stated plainly that Emmanuel's death was not accidental. It was the result of repeated harm. And as horrifying as that conclusion is, the case would soon take an even darker turn, because Emmanuel Haro was not the first child investigators say Jake Haro had hurt. 6 years earlier, in 2018, Jake Haro was charged in a separate child abuse case involving another infant. At the time, he was married to a different woman. Their 10-week-old daughter was taken to the hospital with multiple broken bones. Doctors were alarmed. The injuries were not consistent with an accident. Jake Haro was charged with cruelty to a child. The case moved through the court system, and in 2023, a sentence was handed down. He did not go to prison. Instead, the judge issued a suspended sentence. Probation, work release, community service, no incarceration. The district attorney would later call that decision an outrageous error in judgment. Today, that child is 7 years old. According to prosecutors, she is bedridden. She cannot speak. She lives with permanent, life-altering disabilities. And the man responsible was free. The district attorney would say publicly that had Jake Haro been sentenced to prison for that crime, Emmanuel might still be alive. Those words landed heavily. They raised questions about judicial discretion, about accountability, about how warning signs can be missed, minimized, or ignored until it is too late. As this case moves toward trial, prosecutors are preparing to introduce evidence of that prior abuse to establish a pattern of violence. Defense attorneys are expected to fight its inclusion. Judges will once again decide what the jury is allowed to see. But one fact remains unchanged. A baby is gone. A community was misled. And a lie meant to buy time instead drew a spotlight that exposed something far worse. In the next part, we will examine the early days of the investigation, the evidence that first raised suspicion, and how authorities moved from searching for a missing child to building a murder case against his parents. If you're following this case, let us know your thoughts in the comments, and make sure you're subscribed to Dark Case Desk so you don't miss what comes next. The shift from a missing child investigation to a homicide case did not happen all at once. It unfolded quietly, methodically, and with growing certainty inside law enforcement circles. From the very beginning, detectives noted inconsistencies that could not be explained away by shock or trauma. Rebecca Haro's timeline conflicted with digital evidence. Her physical injuries did not align with the account she gave. Surveillance cameras near the alleged abduction site failed to capture any struggle, any suspect, or any unfamiliar vehicle entering or leaving the area. There was no chaos on camera, no sudden movement, no emergency. Investigators quickly zeroed in on one critical detail. There was no proof Emmanuel Haro had ever been alive on the day he was reported missing. Cell phone records showed activity patterns that contradicted the parents' version of events. GPS data placed the couple in locations that raised serious concern. And medical experts consulted by authorities indicated that Emmanuel's condition, based on available evidence, suggested he had already succumbed to injuries days earlier. The longer detectives examined the case, the clearer the picture became. The kidnapping narrative was not just implausible, it was impossible. Law enforcement sources would later confirm that within 24 hours of the initial report, investigators believed the story was fabricated. From that moment on, every interview, every public appearance, and every statement from Jake and Rebecca Haro was evaluated through a different lens. Not as pleas for help, but as attempts to conceal a crime. As the case gained national attention, media coverage intensified. The Haros' televised interviews were replayed repeatedly. Viewers scrutinized their body language, their wording, their emotional responses. Online forums filled with speculation. True crime communities began dissecting every detail. But detectives did not rely on public opinion. They relied on evidence. And one of the most damning elements came from within the home itself. Investigators examined the family's living conditions, medical history, and prior interactions with social services. What they found suggested a pattern that had gone unnoticed for far too long. Emanuel was not the first child in that household to raise concerns. There had been previous involvement with authorities, previous warnings, previous red flags, and yet Emmanuel remained in the care of his parents. As the investigation deepened, the prosecution began constructing a timeline that starkly contradicted the parents' public story. According to that timeline, Emmanuel Haro suffered repeated physical abuse. The injuries accumulated, the harm escalated, and sometime around the 5th day of August, the infant's body could no longer withstand the trauma. Prosecutors believe Emmanuel died inside his parents' care. What followed, they say, was not panic, it was planning. Authorities allege that instead of seeking medical help, Jake and Rebecca Haro worked together to create a false narrative, a narrative designed to divert suspicion, a narrative designed to buy time, a narrative designed to place blame on a faceless stranger. The decision to go on television was not spontaneous, according to investigators. It was strategic. By involving the media early, the Haros positioned themselves as victims. They appealed directly to the public's empathy. They framed the story in a way that discouraged immediate scrutiny. For a brief moment, it worked. Volunteers poured into the area, donations were raised, nonprofit organizations mobilized resources, strangers prayed for Emmanuel's safe return. But behind the scenes, law enforcement was already moving in a different direction. Search efforts expanded beyond the alleged abduction site. Remote areas were canvassed. Highway corridors were analyzed. Locations tied to the couple's movements in the days following Emmanuel's suspected death became focal points. Then came the moment that would dramatically alter the course of the case. Jake Haro was taken into custody. Shortly thereafter, images surfaced showing him outside a jail facility, escorted by deputies, standing alongside cadaver dogs near a remote roadway. The implication was chilling. Authorities would not say what led them there, only that the investigation had reached a critical stage. The district attorney later confirmed that investigators believed they knew where Emmanuel's remains were located. But even as search teams worked the terrain, another development was unfolding inside the jail. According to reports, Jake Haro began speaking, not to detectives, not to prosecutors, but to someone he believed was just another inmate. The alleged confession, made to a Perkins informant, would mark a turning point. If admissible, it would place responsibility for Emmanuel's death squarely on Jake Haro's shoulders. It would also fracture the united front the couple had maintained since the case began. Rebecca Haro, meanwhile, remained defiant. From her separate jail facility, she continued to insist on the kidnapping story. She granted interviews. She rejected opportunities to shift blame or acknowledge wrongdoing. Even as evidence mounted, she stood by a narrative authorities say was entirely fabricated. To investigators, this divergence between the two parents was telling. It suggested a breakdown in coordination, a crack in the facade, and it opened the door to a strategy prosecutors know well. Turn one defendant against the other. Legal experts observing the case noted that without a body, homicide prosecutions can be challenging, but they are not impossible, especially when the victim was last seen alive in the exclusive care of the accused, especially when there is a documented history of abuse, especially when the defendants themselves lie to law enforcement and the public. The absence of Emmanuel's remains does not erase the evidence of his suffering. Medical experts are expected to testify about the nature of the injuries. digital forensic analysts will walk jurors through timelines and data. Prior acts of abuse may be introduced to establish a pattern, and the lie itself will become a central pillar of the prosecution's case. Because jurors tend to ask one question above all others: why lie if you have nothing to hide? As the legal process moves forward, both Jake and Rebecca Haro face the reality of what comes next. They are being held separately. They are represented by public defenders. They are awaiting arraignment, and somewhere investigators continue searching for Emmanuel. Not to save him, but to bring him home. In the next part, we will examine the prior child abuse case from 2018 in deeper detail, the judge's decision that kept Jake Haro out of prison, and how that ruling now looms over this entire case. If you want to stay with us as this story unfolds, make sure you like this video, leave your thoughts below, and subscribe to Dark Case Desk. As prosecutors prepared their case against Jake and Rebecca Haro, attention turned to a decision made years earlier inside a California courtroom. A decision that now hangs over the death of Emmanuel Haro like an unanswered warning. In the earlier case from 2018, the facts were disturbing even before Emmanuel was born. A 10-week-old infant was rushed to a hospital with multiple fractures. Medical professionals reported injuries inconsistent with normal handling or accidental harm. The child's condition immediately triggered a criminal investigation. That child was Jake Haro's daughter from a previous relationship. Doctors identified broken bones. Authorities charged Jake Haro with felony child cruelty. The case moved forward, and prosecutors sought incarceration, arguing the severity of the injuries justified a prison sentence. But that outcome never came. Instead of a negotiated plea agreement, Jake Haro entered what is known as an open plea. That meant the court, not the prosecution, would determine sentencing. When the time came, the judge exercised discretion and imposed probation with work release rather than prison time. The district attorney later emphasized that this was not a prosecutorial failure. The case had been built. The charges were supported. The evidence was there. The judge simply chose leniency. Years later, prosecutors say that leniency had devastating consequences. The child from that case did not recover. According to the district attorney's office, she lives with permanent disabilities. She cannot walk. She cannot speak. She requires full-time care. Her injuries changed her life forever. Despite this history, Jake Haro was free. He went on to start a new family, and Emmanuel Haro was born into that reality. When Emmanuel entered the world, there was no legal barrier preventing Jake Haro from being in the home. No incarceration, no long-term supervision, no requirement that he be kept away from infants. From a legal standpoint, the system had closed the case. From an investigative standpoint, that closure would later be re-examined with regret. As Emmanuel's case progressed, prosecutors began laying the groundwork to introduce evidence of that prior abuse at trial. Under California law, prior acts of domestic violence and child abuse can be admissible to establish a pattern of behavior. But inclusion is never automatic. A judge must weigh the probative value against potential prejudice. Defense attorneys are expected to argue that the earlier case is unrelated, that it occurred years ago, that Jake Haro was punished and served his sentence, that the jury should focus only on Emmanuel's death. Prosecutors, however, see it differently. They argue the earlier abuse demonstrates a consistent pattern, that it shows how Jake Haro interacted with vulnerable children, that it explains why Emmanuel did not receive medical care, and that it undermines any claim of accident or misunderstanding. Legal analysts following the case note that if the evidence is allowed, it could significantly strengthen the prosecution's argument. Jurors are often influenced by patterns, especially when those patterns involve harm to children. But even with that history, the case is not solely about Jake Haro. Rebecca Haro remains charged with murder as well, and her role presents a different set of challenges for the prosecution. Investigators must establish not only that Emmanuel was abused, but that Rebecca Haro either participated in that abuse or knowingly allowed it to continue. They must prove awareness, intent, failure to protect. Her continued insistence on the kidnapping story complicates her defense. In many cases involving child abuse, secondary caregivers attempt to distance themselves. They claim ignorance, they claim fear, they claim manipulation or coercion by a more dominant partner. Rebecca Haro has not taken that road. Instead, she has doubled down. According to those who have spoken with her, she maintains that Emmanuel was taken by a stranger. She has not acknowledged abuse. She has not accused her husband. She has not claimed to be a victim herself. From a legal standpoint, that rigidity may work against her. If jurors conclude the kidnapping story is false, they may also conclude that her refusal to abandon it reflects consciousness of guilt. Prosecutors are expected to argue that the lie itself is evidence, that it shows coordination, that it shows intent to mislead. Experts note that when defendants maintain a demonstrably false narrative, it often becomes one of the strongest elements of the prosecution's case, because jurors do not need forensic expertise to recognize a lie. They only need common sense. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, investigators continued refining their case. Digital forensic teams analyze phone records, location data, and communication patterns. They look closely at the days between Emmanuel's suspected death and the public report of his disappearance. What they found suggested deliberate delay. Authorities believe Emmanuel's death occurred days before it was reported. During that time, the parents continued normal activity. There were no emergency calls, no hospital visits, no attempts to seek help. That gap in time is critical. Prosecutors are expected to argue that it demonstrates opportunity. It allowed for planning. It allowed for disposal. It allowed for the construction of a false narrative. And it raises another painful question. If Emmanuel could not be saved, why wasn't help called? As the case heads toward arraignment, both defendants face the same charge: murder. But legal analysts predict their paths may diverge. Jake Haro, if the alleged confession is admitted, may be positioned toward a strategy focused on mitigation rather than acquittal. Cooperation, disclosure of Emmanuel's location, acceptance of responsibility. Rebecca Haro faces a more complex decision. If she continues to deny reality, she risks being viewed as equally culpable. If she shifts blame, she risks contradicting her own statements. Either path carries consequences, and at the center of it all is Emmanuel Haro, a child who never had a voice, a child whose story is now being told in courtrooms and headlines instead of lullabies and milestones. In the next part, we will examine the legal mechanics of the alleged jailhouse confession, how Perkins informants are used, and what hurdles prosecutors must overcome to present that confession to a jury. As the case progressed, one of the most legally complex elements began to take shape far from cameras and courtrooms. Inside a jail environment where conversations are rarely private and trust is often an illusion. The alleged confession attributed to Jake Haro did not come during a formal interrogation. It did not occur across a metal table in an interview room. And it did not involve Miranda warnings or direct questioning by detectives. Instead, it reportedly emerged during casual conversation with a fellow inmate. What Jake Haro did not know, according to reports, was that the inmate was a Perkins informant. This technique, named after a Supreme Court ruling, allows law enforcement to place an undercover officer or cooperating individual near a suspect to listen rather than interrogate. The distinction matters, because legally there is a fine line between passive listening and deliberate elicitation. If law enforcement directs an informant to prompt incriminating statements after a defendant has invoked the right to counsel, the confession can be ruled inadmissible. Prosecutors will need to show that any statements Jake Haro made were voluntary, that the informant did not question him, that there was no coercion, inducement, or manipulation beyond the natural environment of incarceration. Defense attorneys are expected to challenge this aggressively. They may argue that the confession was unreliable, that jailhouse statements are often exaggerated, that inmates speak to impress others, relieve stress, or cope with fear. They may also argue that the informant subtly guided the conversation in ways that violate constitutional protections. Judges take these issues seriously. Before a jury ever hears a word of the alleged confession, a separate evidentiary hearing will determine whether it can be admitted. The ruling could shape the entire trajectory of the trial. If the confession is allowed, it may become the prosecution's most powerful evidence. If it is excluded, prosecutors will rely more heavily on circumstantial evidence, digital data, medical testimony, and the defendant's own statements to the media. Regardless of the outcome, the existence of the alleged confession has already altered the dynamics of the case. It has shifted leverage. It has introduced the possibility of cooperation, and it has placed pressure on both defendants in different ways. For Jake Haro, legal observers note that confession changes the calculus. At that point, the focus often turns from acquittal to mitigation. Cooperation with authorities, disclosure of Emmanuel's location, acceptance of responsibility in exchange for the possibility of parole eligibility rather than life without it. Those decisions are not made lightly. They involve negotiations behind closed doors. They involve weighing the certainty of a sentence against the uncertainty of trial. And they involve moral considerations that can haunt a defendant long after a verdict is rendered. For Rebecca Haro, the alleged confession presents a different threat. If Jake Haro implicates himself alone, her defense team may attempt to argue she was unaware of the abuse or powerless to stop it. But if he implicates both of them, her position becomes far more precarious. And at the time of this writing, she has not adjusted her public or private narrative. Investigators have taken note. They have also taken note of the timing. According to prosecutors, Emmanuel's death occurred days before it was reported. That delay suggests decision-making. It suggests deliberation. It suggests actions taken after the fact. One of the questions jurors are expected to hear repeatedly is simple but devastating. If this was an accident, why wait? Why not call emergency services? Why not rush to a hospital? Why not seek help? Prosecutors will argue that the delay points to awareness of guilt, that the parents knew the injuries were not survivable, that they understood medical professionals would identify abuse, and that knowledge, they say, motivated everything that followed. The lie, the media appearances, the false kidnapping report. As the legal process moves forward, both defendants remain in custody, housed separately, with limited communication. This separation is intentional. It prevents coordination. It prevents alignment of stories. It increases the likelihood of inconsistent statements. And inconsistencies are where cases are often won. Investigators continue working toward recovering Emmanuel's remains. Authorities have not disclosed the precise location they are focused on, only that they believe they know where he is. Recovery teams remain prepared to move quickly should cooperation increase or new information emerge. The absence of a body does not stop the case, but its recovery would end uncertainty. It would allow forensic experts to document injuries. It would allow medical examiners to determine cause and manner of death with greater specificity, and it would allow Emmanuel to be laid to rest. As the public awaits the next court appearance, legal experts emphasize that this case will hinge on credibility. Who jurors believe, what they believe happened inside that home, and whether the evidence paints a picture so clear that no alternative explanation survives scrutiny. In the next part, we will examine how prosecutors are expected to structure their case at trial, how juries historically respond to parent-on-child homicide cases, and what outcomes are realistically on the table for each defendant. As the case approaches its next procedural stage, prosecutors are no longer focused on investigation alone. Their attention has shifted to presentation, because trials are not won by evidence alone, but by how that evidence is understood. In a case involving the death of an infant, the prosecution's strategy must balance precision with restraint. Emotional arguments are powerful, but juries are instructed to decide based on facts, not outrage. Experienced prosecutors know that overreaching can undermine credibility, especially in cases already saturated with public attention. Instead, the expected approach is methodical. The state will likely begin by anchoring the jury in one central truth. Emmanuel Haro was completely dependent on his caregivers. He had no autonomy, no mobility, no ability to escape harm or seek help. Whatever happened to him happened in a controlled environment, under the supervision of the people legally and morally responsible for his safety. From there, prosecutors are expected to construct their case in layers. First, they will establish custody and access. Emmanuel was not in daycare. He was not with a babysitter. He was not in the care of extended family. He was exclusively under the supervision of his parents during the relevant time period. Second, they will introduce medical testimony. Even without remains, pediatric experts can testify about the nature of injuries consistent with fatal child abuse. They can explain how repeated trauma presents. They can describe what symptoms would have been visible. They can clarify whether a reasonable caregiver would have recognized distress. This testimony serves a dual purpose. It establishes cause, and it eliminates accident. Next comes the digital evidence: phone activity, location data, communication patterns. Prosecutors will walk jurors through timelines showing when Emmanuel was last likely alive, when no medical help was sought, and when the false report was made. The delay becomes a narrative of its own, one that suggests consciousness rather than confusion. Then comes the lie. The kidnapping story will not be treated as a side issue. It will be central. Prosecutors are expected to argue that innocent parents do not fabricate abductions, that lies of this magnitude require intent, planning, coordination, and jurors will be shown how quickly law enforcement disproved the claim. No suspect descriptions, no corroborating witnesses, no physical evidence of an attack. Just a story that collapsed under scrutiny. For juries, false statements often speak louder than silence. A defendant who says nothing can still be presumed innocent. A defendant who lies creates their own evidence. As for defense strategies, both sides face uphill battles, but for different reasons. Jake Haro's defense, according to legal analysts, is unlikely to pursue full denial if the alleged confession is admitted. In such cases, defense teams often pivot toward minimizing intent, challenging degree of culpability, arguing lack of premeditation, emphasizing emotional instability or impaired judgment. The goal becomes sentencing, not acquittal. For Rebecca Haro, the situation is more complex. Prosecutors must prove either direct participation or knowing failure to protect. That requires showing awareness, knowledge of abuse, conscious disregard for Emmanuel's safety. Her continued adherence to the kidnapping narrative complicates any attempt to claim ignorance. Defense attorneys may argue she trusted her husband, that she did not understand the severity of Emmanuel's condition, that she believed seeking help would make things worse. But those arguments require jurors to accept that a mother failed to act even as her infant suffered. Historically, juries are skeptical of such claims, especially when the caregiver is physically present, especially when no effort is made to seek medical care, especially when the response is deception rather than emergency. Legal experts following the case have noted another factor that will likely influence jurors: the absence of remorse in public-facing behavior. While defendants are not required to show emotion, jurors often expect some visible distress when a child has died. The lack of it can shape perception, even subconsciously. This is why defense teams typically advise silence. Public interviews rarely help. In this case, the early media appearances may become one of the defense's greatest liabilities. As the case moves forward, judges will rule on motions that shape what jurors are allowed to hear. The admissibility of prior abuse, the jailhouse statements, the scope of expert testimony. Each ruling narrows the battlefield. And while trials can last weeks, sometimes verdicts come quickly. In cases involving infant victims, jurors often reach conclusions once a coherent narrative forms. The law does not require certainty. It requires proof beyond a reasonable doubt. Prosecutors appear confident they can meet that burden. But one element still looms over everything. Emmanuel's body has not been recovered. And while the law does not require remains to secure a conviction, their recovery would remove the final ambiguity. It would allow science to speak where speculation cannot. It would allow Emmanuel to be seen not as an abstraction, but as a child whose injuries tell a story. Investigators continue to work toward that goal, and every decision made by the defendants from this point forward may determine whether that story is ever fully told. In the next part, we will examine potential plea scenarios, sentencing realities under California law, and what justice may ultimately look like in this case. If you're still following, like this video, leave your thoughts below, and subscribe to Dark Case Desk for the continuation. As the case enters a more mature phase, attention turns to what often unfolds beyond public view: negotiations. Not every criminal case ends in a jury verdict. Many are resolved through plea discussions shaped by risk, leverage, and the reality of sentencing exposure. In cases involving the death of a child, plea bargaining becomes especially complex. Prosecutors must weigh accountability against certainty. Defense attorneys must weigh denial against survival. And judges must ensure that any resolution reflects both justice and the law. Under California law, murder carries severe penalties. Depending on the degree, a conviction can result in decades behind bars or life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. That reality places enormous pressure on defendants, particularly when evidence continues to mount. For Jake Haro, the alleged jailhouse statements, if upheld, create leverage for the prosecution. Confessions change the posture of a case. They introduce the possibility of cooperation, not just in theory, but in practice. Prosecutors may seek information that only one person can provide, details about what happened, how it happened, and where Emmanuel was taken afterward. In some cases, recovery of remains becomes a bargaining chip, not as a trade for freedom, but as a factor in sentencing consideration. Courts often view cooperation that brings closure to a victim's family as mitigating, even when the crime itself remains severe. That does not mean leniency, it means distinction. There is a difference between dying in prison and the possibility of parole decades later. That distinction can shape decisions made in jail cells late at night, long after cameras are gone. For Rebecca Haro, plea considerations are even more delicate. If prosecutors believe she played a secondary role, they may consider reduced charges in exchange for truthful testimony. But such offers depend on credibility. A defendant who has maintained a false narrative publicly may struggle to convince prosecutors that a sudden change reflects honesty rather than strategy. Timing matters. The longer a false story is maintained, the harder it becomes to walk it back. Prosecutors will also consider public interest. This case has drawn national attention. Any plea agreement will be scrutinized. Families of victims, advocacy groups, and the public often view negotiated outcomes in child death cases with skepticism. That scrutiny influences prosecutorial discretion. It raises the bar. Beyond sentencing, the case has triggered broader institutional reflection. Officials have acknowledged that earlier interventions failed. Systems designed to protect vulnerable children did not prevent this outcome. That acknowledgement does not change what happened, but it has consequences. Reviews are underway, policies are being questioned, judicial discretion in severe child abuse cases is being re-examined. Cases like this do not exist in isolation. They ripple outward, they influence future rulings, they shape how agencies respond to warning signs, they alter how risk is assessed. In that sense, Emmanuel Haro's case may have impact beyond the courtroom, but none of that restores a life. As months pass, the emotional intensity of public reaction often fades, but the legal process continues. Motions are filed, hearings are scheduled, evidence is cataloged, witness lists are finalized. For the defendants, time takes on a different meaning. Days blur together inside custody. Decisions carry irreversible weight. Silence, cooperation, denial, or admission each lead down different paths. For investigators, the focus remains fixed. They continue working toward recovery. They follow leads. They revisit locations. They remain prepared to act if new information emerges. And for the public, the story becomes one of waiting for answers, waiting for accountability, waiting for closure. In cases involving children, closure rarely feels complete, but the law offers its own form of resolution, a determination of responsibility, a formal acknowledgement of wrongdoing, a sentence imposed by the state. In the next part, we will explore how juries historically respond when no remains are recovered, how circumstantial cases are weighed, and why verdicts in such cases often arrive sooner than expected. When a case reaches the point where jurors are finally seated, much of what determines the outcome has already happened. Evidence has been filtered, arguments have been narrowed, and the story that will be told has been shaped long before opening statements begin. In cases where a body has not been recovered, jurors often enter the courtroom with questions rather than doubts. They want to understand how certainty can exist without physical remains. Prosecutors anticipate this and address it directly, not defensively, but methodically. They explain that the law does not require a body. It requires proof of death and proof of criminal responsibility. Those elements can be established through behavior, timing, and context. Jurors are guided to focus on what is present rather than what is missing. They are shown that deaths do not vanish simply because remains are unrecovered, that people do not disappear without cause, that infants do not cease to exist without explanation. In these cases, circumstantial evidence becomes cumulative rather than isolated. Each piece alone may seem incomplete. Together, they form a closed loop. Emmanuel Haro's case fits that pattern. Jurors will hear about what did not happen. No emergency calls, no hospital visits, no outside caregivers, no verifiable sighting after a specific point in time, no credible explanation. Silence becomes evidence. Absence becomes evidence. Delay becomes evidence. And jurors are often receptive to that logic because it aligns with everyday reasoning. People recognize patterns in daily life. They know when something does not make sense. Trials simply formalize that intuition. Another factor jurors consider, often subconsciously, is control. Who had control over the situation? Who had the ability to act? Who had the responsibility to intervene? In this case, control never left the home. That reality narrows the field of possible explanations until only one remains. Legal analysts note that in trials involving infant victims, deliberations are often shorter than expected. Not because jurors are careless, but because the questions before them are limited. There are fewer alternative narratives to weigh, fewer unknown actors, fewer plausible scenarios. The defense may attempt to introduce uncertainty, to argue that the state cannot prove exactly how death occurred, to suggest that something unforeseen or unknowable intervened. But jurors are instructed that the law does not require absolute certainty. It requires proof beyond a reasonable doubt. That distinction is critical. Beyond a reasonable doubt does not mean beyond all doubt. It means doubt grounded in reason and evidence, not speculation. Speculation does not carry weight in deliberation rooms. Jurors are also guided to evaluate credibility, not just what witnesses say, but how their statements align with evidence. Consistency matters. Timing matters. Motivation matters. False statements, even if made before arrest, often weigh heavily in jurors' minds. They ask why deception was necessary, what it was meant to conceal, and whether it points to knowledge of guilt. As the trial unfolds, the courtroom atmosphere is likely to be restrained. Judges in cases like this often limit emotional displays. Graphic imagery may be restricted. Language may be carefully chosen. This is not done to minimize harm, but to preserve fairness. Even so, the subject matter remains difficult. Jurors are reminded repeatedly that their role is not to punish, but to decide. Sentencing comes later. Their task is to determine whether the charges have been proven. Once deliberations begin, the case enters its quietest phase. No cameras, no commentary, no speculation. Just 12 people in a room, reviewing evidence and weighing responsibility. Sometimes verdicts come quickly, sometimes they do not. But in cases where the narrative has closed in on itself, where alternatives have been eliminated one by one, the decision often feels inevitable. Whatever the outcome, it will mark the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. For the defendants, it will determine the course of their lives. For the legal system, it will stand as a record of how the case was resolved. And for Emmanuel Haro, it will be the only form of justice the system can offer. In the final part, we will examine what happens after the verdict, how cases like this are remembered, and what Emmanuel's story leaves behind. After verdicts are read and courtrooms empty, the legal system moves on quickly. Paperwork is filed, records are archived, judges proceed to the next case. But for stories like this, the ending is not defined by sentencing alone. What remains is impact. Long after the cameras leave, Emmanuel Haro's name will exist in fragments, in court transcripts, in appellate filings, in training materials for investigators and social workers. His life, though brief, becomes a reference point for what happens when warning signs fail to stop momentum. In cases involving child deaths, the justice system often measures success in binary terms. Conviction or acquittal, guilty or not guilty, but those outcomes do not capture the full weight of what has occurred. They do not answer the questions that linger once punishment is imposed. How many chances were missed? How many signals were minimized? How many opportunities existed to intervene? These questions do not belong to a jury. They belong to institutions. When prosecutors publicly acknowledge that a prior decision may have contributed to a later death, it is not merely commentary. It is an admission that systems designed to prevent harm can fail, even when evidence exists. That failure does not rest on one person alone. It is distributed across processes, discretion, and thresholds for action. Emmanuel's case forces a reckoning with that reality. Child abuse cases rarely exist in isolation. They are often preceded by reports that do not meet the legal standard for removal, by injuries explained away, by narratives accepted because alternatives are uncomfortable. The law requires certainty, but children live in probability, and probability does not always trigger protection. Once a case like this concludes, agencies review policies quietly. Risk assessment tools are revisited, training materials are updated, judges attend seminars, social services adjust protocols. None of this is publicized widely, but it happens. Change arrives slowly, too slowly for Emmanuel. Public memory is another matter. True crime audiences tend to fixate on villains and verdicts. But over time, names blur, details fade. Only the most extreme cases remain culturally visible. What determines whether a case endures is not just its outcome, but what it represents. Emmanuel Haro's case represents the cost of delay, the cost of disbelief, the cost of assuming that prior harm will not repeat itself. It also represents a hard truth about accountability. The justice system is reactive by design. It intervenes after harm occurs. It punishes after damage is done. Prevention is aspirational, not guaranteed. That is not a failure of intent. It is a limitation of structure. For families who follow cases like this, closure is an abstract concept. There is no sentence long enough to balance a life lost. There is no explanation sufficient to resolve grief. Courts can acknowledge wrongdoing, but they cannot restore trust in a world that allowed harm to continue. For the public, stories like this provoke a familiar cycle: shock, anger, mourning, and eventually distance. But distance does not mean resolution. Emmanuel's story remains unresolved in ways the law cannot address. It exists as a reminder that harm can persist quietly, even when it has already announced itself once before. And that reminder matters, because each case that exposes a systemic failure creates an opportunity for the next child to be protected earlier. Each uncomfortable truth becomes a data point. Each outcome informs future decisions, even when those decisions are made by people who never hear Emmanuel's name. This is how legacy works in cases like this. Not through memorials, not through headlines, but through prevention that arrives too late for one child and just in time for another. In the next continuation, we will explore how cases like Emmanuel Haro's are handled in appellate review, how responsibility extends beyond individual defendants, and how society decides what lessons it is willing to learn. After sentencing, the case does not truly end. It transitions into a quieter phase, one that unfolds far from headlines but carries lasting influence over how the justice system interprets its own actions. Appeals are a routine part of criminal law, particularly in cases involving severe sentences. Defense teams review trial transcripts line by line, searching for procedural errors, evidentiary rulings, or constitutional questions that could justify review. These appeals are not emotional arguments. They are technical, precise, detached. They ask whether evidence was admitted correctly, whether jury instructions were proper, whether defendants received effective representation. They do not retry the case. They examine the process. For victims and the public, appellate proceedings can feel frustrating. Years may pass without visible progress, but appellate courts serve a specific role. They ensure that outcomes are legally sound, not merely emotionally satisfying. In doing so, they reinforce the legitimacy of verdicts that withstand scrutiny. In cases like Emmanuel Haro's, appellate courts often focus on evidentiary balance, whether prior conduct evidence was properly admitted, whether statements made outside formal interrogation met constitutional standards, whether the trial court maintained fairness despite public attention. These reviews are clinical by design. They do not speak Emmanuel's name with reverence. They speak it as a case identifier, and yet their rulings shape future prosecutions involving vulnerable victims. They clarify what evidence is permissible. They define how far the state may go to establish patterns of abuse. They refine the boundaries of lawful investigation. This is how individual cases influence systemic behavior. Beyond appellate courts, professional communities also absorb the case in quieter ways. Judges discuss it privately. Prosecutors analyze it in training sessions. Defense attorneys cite it in strategy discussions. Social workers reference it when advocating for earlier intervention. It becomes part of institutional memory, not as a tragedy, but as a precedent. Medical professionals, particularly those working in pediatrics and emergency care, often revisit cases like this to examine reporting thresholds. When should suspicion override uncertainty? When should caution give way to escalation? These decisions are rarely clear in real time, but hindsight clarifies patterns, and patterns inform future responses. Child welfare agencies also face internal reckoning. When a child has been previously harmed and later dies, reviews are conducted, files are reopened, decisions are examined. Not to assign blame, but to identify failure points. Did information remain siloed? Did risk assessments undervalue severity? Did prior outcomes create false reassurance? These questions are uncomfortable, but they are necessary. Societal response extends beyond institutions. Cases involving children often reshape public expectations. Communities become more alert. Educators become more vigilant. Neighbors become more willing to report concerns. Sometimes that vigilance is imperfect. It can lead to over-reporting, to suspicion where none exists. But it also leads to intervention that saves lives. Fear is not the goal. Awareness is. Emmanuel Haro's story sits within that tension. It warns against complacency without demanding paranoia. It underscores the importance of taking early harm seriously without assuming inevitability. It also challenges narratives about evil. It reminds us that harm does not always announce itself dramatically. It can exist quietly, normalized by familiarity, shielded by routine, and that is what makes it dangerous. Public discourse around cases like this often centers on punishment, on how long a sentence should be, on whether it is sufficient. But punishment is not prevention, it is response. True prevention occurs upstream, in early medical visits, in careful judicial decisions, in credible assessments of risk. Emmanuel's case forces society to confront how often those upstream moments are undervalued, because their consequences are invisible when they succeed. No headline announces the child who was protected because an intervention occurred early. No documentary chronicles the harm that never happened. But those outcomes matter just as much. As time passes, Emmanuel's name may appear less frequently, but within professional circles, it remains present, as a reminder, as a caution, as a reference point for decisions that carry irreversible weight. This is how memory persists when attention fades, not through repetition, but through responsibility. In the final continuation, we will examine the ethical boundaries of true crime storytelling itself, the responsibility of audiences and creators, and how telling Emmanuel Haro's story can honor truth without exploiting tragedy. Every time a story like this is told, a question lingers that is rarely addressed directly. Not a legal question, not an investigative one, but an ethical one. What does it mean to tell the story of a child who cannot consent to being remembered this way? True crime exists at a crossroads between documentation and exposure. It preserves facts, but it also risks reducing lives to narratives shaped by harm. The difference lies in intention, whether a story is told to provoke outrage or to preserve understanding, whether it is framed to sensationalize pain or to examine responsibility. Emmanuel Haro's life did not begin as a case. It did not exist to teach lessons. It was not meant to become evidence. He was a child whose existence was defined entirely by dependency. His world consisted of caregivers, routine, and trust. That trust was broken not in a moment of spectacle, but in private, away from witnesses. That reality matters, because it challenges the way stories are often consumed. It resists neat conclusions. It denies the audience emotional release. There is no resolution that feels proportional, no ending that restores balance, and that discomfort is important. True crime should not comfort, it should clarify. It should leave space for reflection rather than closure. It should ask audiences to sit with uncertainty rather than rush toward judgment. In telling Emmanuel's story, the responsibility is not only to recount what happened, but to avoid what should never happen again. That requires restraint. It requires precision. It requires refusing to exaggerate where facts already carry weight. It also requires remembering that attention is fleeting, but consequences are permanent. For creators, the power to shape narrative carries obligation. Choices about language, pacing, and emphasis influence how audiences perceive harm. They can either reinforce accountability or distort it. This is why restraint matters. Emmanuel's story does not need embellishment. It does not need dramatization. It does not need villains amplified beyond their actions. The facts alone are sufficient. For audiences, there is also responsibility to engage thoughtfully, to resist turning tragedy into entertainment, to remember that behind every case file is a life that cannot be restored. Attention should lead to awareness, not desensitization. Awareness should lead to vigilance, not fear, and vigilance should lead to intervention when it matters most. Emmanuel Haro's legacy will not be written in verdicts alone. It will exist in the decisions made by people who never knew him, in the moments when uncertainty is treated as caution rather than dismissal, in the willingness to act before harm becomes irreversible. That is the only form of justice that extends beyond punishment. And that is why stories like this are told, not to relive suffering, but to prevent its repetition. If you have stayed with this story from beginning to end, thank you for listening with care. If you believe these stories matter, take a moment to like this video, share your thoughts respectfully, and subscribe to Dark Case Desk. Because remembering responsibly is one of the few ways the future can change.